Welcome back to Alex Gordon Audios. Imperium Ascendant continues its chronicle of a new timeline. The foundation of a galactic empire is not laid with armies alone. It requires pillars of belief, infrastructure, and leadership. Tonight, we witness the forging of those very pillars. We begin with the deconstruction of old faiths and the birth of a new imperial truth. We then ascend to the Himalayas for the lighting of the Astronomican, a psychic lighthouse that will forever change the face of the warp. And finally, we will enter the inner palace to observe the first years of the 20 Primarchs as they are raised to become not just warriors, but the paragons humanity needs. The Great Crusade has not yet begun, but the Imperium is truly being born tonight. Chapter 9. The First Temple. Olither was old, not just physically but mentally and spiritually. He could feel the weight of the years in his bones and upon his soul. Ironically, he had not lived as many years as some, and was just entering the second half of his life. Yet the years he had spent alive were especially harsh ones. Wars had been fought, families lost, homes burned, and ways of life driving to extinction. These thoughts occupied the old priest of the Church of the Lighting Stone. As he extinguished candles and cleaned the old place of worship, Iara had joined the creed as a young man, and had watched as his congregation had shrunk with each passing year. The Emperor's truth saw to that. Religion had been declared the enemy, a source of woes and misery. Every month new reports came in of great cathedrals and temples being looted, converted and torn down. Horror stories of clerics and cardinals being dragged away into the night persisted, with many religious sites becoming abandoned due to their clergy fleeing the Emperor's minions. Some of Uriah's more devout partitioners had asked and even begged to help him flee the purges. He had turned each and every one of them down, telling each that I have lived for this church, and if need be, I will die for this church. Eventually, even those most devout had stopped coming. The past few weeks, Uriah had been alone in the ancient building, with nothing but the crashing of the sea's waves and ancient scripture for company. Letting out a deep sigh, the old priest went to lock the great oaken doors of the building. Right as he approached them, a knock sounded at the door. Sighing to himself, Imperia went to the door, wondering who could have come calling at this late hour. The doors swing open, and a man stood before Ymara. Clothed in the uniform of an imperial officer, the raven-haired man struck an imposing figure. The man looked into Ymara's eyes, and the priest had the unpleasant sensation that he was being studied like a scientific specimen, being prepared for dissection. A subconscious shiver ran up Ymara's spine at the thought. The strange man reached out his hand to shake Uriah's and spoke. "You are Father Uriah Olither, priest of the Lighting Stone Church, correct?" Refocusing and shaking off the momentary anxiety, Uriah took the stranger's hand and spoke. "Yes, and you are. You can simply call me Revelation." Uriah scoffed at that. "How ominous! What can this old priest help you with, Revelation?" A momentary pained expression crossed the stranger's face before he continued. "I seek your counsel." Revelation's inflection stunk of disdain, and he was obviously disgusted with the idea. Imperia had seen pride and ego of countless varieties throughout his tenure, and he could easily recognize the signs of a man who detested asking for help. A kind smile appeared on the priest's face, and he spoke. "Of course, my son. Come in, come in." Ayara led the man toward the pews and noticed the stranger examining the various frescoes and paintings that adorned the church. Ayara smiled. The art of the church had long been something he had enjoyed and loved sharing with worshippers. Revelation pointed at a trinity of paintings that took up one of the walls. Is Angela Verona's work? "I have not seen some of hers in many years." Imperia's face brightened. "It's been decades since someone recognized her work. One of my predecessors was gifted that piece after she attended one of his sermons." The three paintings showed iconic scenes from the church's creed. The first depicted nude figures within a utopian garden, the second an epic duel between a golden knight and a silver dragon, and the last showed a being made of light surrounded by a mechanical halo. The stranger continued to state for a minute before he turned to the priest and spoke. "Do you know what has been the fate of the grand churches and temples of Terra?" Imperia eyed Revelation's uniform and began to wonder if this visit was more sinister in nature than he originally thought. The old priest sighed and spoke. "Yes, they have been destroyed by the Emperor and his legions. Is that why you have come to destroy my church like all the others have been? At that Revelation's eyes seemed to lose all emotion, and he spoke. Yes, but your counsel is required as well. Revelation walked up to the altar and continued speaking. Do you know how many churches exist on Terra? How many priests are left? Barely processing the news of his impending eviction and possible execution, Uriah spoke. A few hundred, a few thousand. Your master has been through in his mission from what I hear. At that a snort of derision escaped Revelation. Only one of each remain. He gestured to Uriah and the building they were in, the last church and the last priest of Terra. Isha felt like a hammer blow had come down on his forehead. Could he truly be the last priest? Could all traces of faith be scoured from humanity's cradle this easily? A mixture of grief and anger filled Uriah's heart. In a bitter voice he spat. So what counsel could you possibly seek from me? You serve the regime that has more successfully extinguished the light of faith and salvation. What in the name Yeshua crossed could you want from me? Bitterness filled Revelation's face as he spoke. I want to know if I was wrong. I concluded that religion is a toxic, dangerous thing a long time ago, and time and again that conclusion has been reinforced by countless acts of insanity and zealotry I have witnessed. Rage filled Revelation's face as he finished. Letting out a defeated sigh, he continued. Yet despite that, new evidence has come to light. Evidence that no matter what is done, humanity will seek something or someone to worship, and that faith can be used to protect against the darkness. Isha had met many atheists, agnostics, and naysayers throughout his career. Their reasoning and beliefs varied, and it was not atypical for him to encounter those attempting to refute his faith or rekindle their own. Revelation seemed to be both, but not quite. He spoke more like a scientist questioning results than a tortured soul seeking solace in their own convictions or faith. Isha slowly approached Revelation and spoke. Tell me, my son, what has caused this change in your beliefs? The old priest was not just doing his duty as a man of the cloth, but genuine curiosity. The stranger who had entered his church was obviously a high-ranking member of the Imperium, someone who should sneer at the idea of religion and laugh at the idea that it was more than a narcotic for the masses. Yet shadows of doubt encircled Revelation, and a curious thought occurred to Uriah. This stranger spoke with such authority and without fear. Someone of his position should be terrified of being discovered anywhere near a place of worship, not being sacked, let alone asking a priest for advice. Obviously, Revelation was a person of great power and authority. Could his arrival be a sign from the heavens that maybe the flames of faith were not yet doomed to be extinguished? Revelation spoke to Uriah in a hushed whisper. I saw something, a vision. At this, Uriah raised an eyebrow. Such things were the domain of prophets and seers, many of whom had been put to death by the Imperium. What did you see, my child? I saw a future where the Emperor is worshipped as a god, where everything he stands for is perverted into a colossal theocratic nightmare, where trillions of screaming fanatics live and die underneath the rule of the immortal God, Emperor of mankind. The words seemed to physically pain Revelation to speak, but he continued. But the worst of it, the worst aspect of that nightmarish future where hope, reason, and logic were butchered in the name of dogma, zealotry, and oppression, was that it worked. Humanity was truly united under the imperial creed. Faith protected against horrors beyond imagination. It fueled heroic acts and empowered the loyalist of mankind. Revelation seemed to sag underneath some invisible burden, and he slumped onto the front pew. The ancient wood groaned as if a dozen men had sat down instead of one. Uriah sat next to his guest and said softly, I am no prophet nor psyker, but I could predict such a vision perfectly. The priest gestured around them as he spoke. Humanity has sought to believe in a higher power for as long as we have existed. Belief offers both protection and answers to countless questions. It grants solace, and if that solace is denied, the yearning for it becomes simply greater. At that, Revelation snapped. Yet I have given them exactly that. Protection from every evil and abomination to stalk the shadows. The arts and sciences are slowly returning to their former greatness to answer questions of both material and immaterial nature. A mixture of fury and questioning worry filled Revelation's eyes. Imperia, confused by the strange wording of Revelation's outburst, looked into his eyes and was shocked at what he saw. Revelation looked no older than 40 standard years, but his eyes were those of an ancient filled with centuries if not millennia of pain and knowledge. Realization and shock filled the old priest as the truth dawned on him. The realization of his guest's identity. The emperor of mankind had come to seek his counsel. Rumors had abounded for years about the age and nature of the mysterious conqueror of Terra, the man who was equal parts tyrannical overlord and benevolent leader. Taking a deep breath, Uriah gathered himself and continued. Even if you offer alternatives to what religion offers and show the world all that is negative about it, people will still desire it. Religion and faith are as old as humanity. Even during the heights of the Golden Age it still existed, when nearly every evil and darkness in our species had been eradicated. It is not an evil thing, but just as corruptible as so much else of being human. Humanity needs to believe in a higher power, and denying that will only lead to ruin. The emperor in disguise looked at Uriah and sadness filled his voice. You know who I am. I saw it within your mind when you realized the truth. No need to hide it, Uriah. Shutting his ancient eyes, the emperor continued. You are wrong about one thing for certain. Religion is not as old as humanity. I have lived for close to 50,000 years, and I remember when the first cults and tribal religions rose. Slowly standing, the emperor walked up to the altar and stood at it like an expectant worshipper. And the idea that religion is a constant is also wrong. I am responsible for its creation, and it's only fitting I am responsible for its destruction. Stunned silence filled the church as Uriah processed the claim. Speaking softly, the priest asked in a tone that was both incredulous and horrified. Do you mean to say you founded my faith? That you founded humanity's great religions, and you see it as your duty to destroy them? A part of Uriah, a very large part, wanted to dismiss the stranger's claims, to say he was a madman, a tyrant, not an immortal who had walked the ages. Yet something stopped Uriah, some instinctive feeling, some deep-set ancestral memory locked within the human species, the mark on the human psyche left by the emperor. Thousands of cultures throughout all of human history had tales of mysterious immortals, wandering gods, and superhuman monarchs. Every legend starts with a kernel of truth, and something within Uriah told him the source of a million myths sat before him. The emperor let out a bitter laugh at Uriah's question. Yes, countless religions have sprung up in my footsteps. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes not, but my sin is greater than inspiring a stray cult whenever I needed to take action. Humanity's desire, no, need for a higher power to worship and follow is my fault. Moving faster than the priest could process, the emperor stood next to him and placed his palm on Uriah's forehead. Before anything could leave his lips, golden light crashed into Uriah's mind, and everything went white. A voice filled with power and wisdom echoed in Uriah's mind as he drifted through a psychically created void. What is a god? Trying to get his bearings, the stunned Uriah tried to speak. God is the creator and ruler of the universe and source of all moral authority, the supreme being. A deep chuckle answered that, and the voice continued. That is the textbook description of the deity of your faith. I ask you not what your God is, but what is a god? After thinking for a second, Uriah responded. Something powerful, something beyond humanity, a supernatural being that is worshipped. To that, the voice seemed to consider the answer given before speaking. Understandable. Many beings fit your description and have indeed been worshipped as gods throughout human history. Even so, Uriah, would you consider these beings fit to worship? Reality shifted again, and Uriah found himself transported between countless realities, each more horrifying than the last. A titanic silver monster, with wings that blotted out the sun, and eyes burning with horrid green energy, sat in an ancient desert temple, where thousands of ancient humans kneeled before it, awaiting their turn to be consumed by the dragon from between the stars. Chapter: Millions of soldiers wearing incredibly advanced armor battling billions of lobotomized corpses, puppeteered by a world-sized abominable intelligence, a godly hive mind that tainted and twisted all it touched, manipulating and creating entire worlds of mutated dredges that prayed for their inevitable consumption and assimilation. shimmering bioluminescent Xenos indoctrinating world after world into becoming enthralled slaves who served their masters every whim till they were drained into desiccated husks, things made of nightmares and madness slithering out of cracks in reality to corrupt and control those desperate enough to seek it. These and countless more nightmarish visages appeared before Iara, each traumatizing and sickening the priest more than the last. For a moment the kaleidoscope of monsters stopped. The Emperor's voice spoke again. Each of those abominations has claimed godhood. Each used humanity's addiction to the divine to feed itself and enslave us. I have battled many of them and intend to cut the yoke of faith away so it may never divide us, nor be used by our enemies. Fighting off panic attacks and the urge to vomit, Isha managed to speak. So that's your rationale? Humanity has been manipulated and controlled by countless things. Why pick out religion as your scapegoat and target of your ire? The white space rumbled with the sound of distant thunder as the Emperor responded. The god things I showed you use faith as a mean to an end. That is not the case with the greatest foes, the only foe that matters. They do not use faith to control or manipulate, but to grow in power and tear down the barriers between the real and the insane. 4 new visions appeared before Uriah at once. 4 storm of insanity and horror that swirled around him, projections of a remembered vision, muted for a mortal's mind. And still, they seethed with such corruption and cruelty that the priest could feel it seeping into his very soul. Each of the monsters touched his soul, leaving imprints of nightmares and all that is wrong with mortal kind upon his memory. The hound-headed bloody warrior showed visions of insanity and violence, where entire worlds were butchered in psychotic fury. A column of whispering smoke spoke of a trillion plots of betrayal and mutation. The unmistakable stench of rot filled Uriah's nostrils as a bloated corpse dribbled diseased poison disguised as love and acceptance. Last of the 4 was a vision of a great winged serpent that gorged itself upon its creators and sang a song of beauty and horror. The quadrifold monsters were each unique and horrible in their own way, but Uriah recognized a similarity between all 4, their hunger, an unending painful hunger for more and more. Never content, they each sought to corrupt and control everything they could. Uriah shuddered as he regained his surroundings and realized he had fallen to his knees within the church. Looking up, he saw the Emperor standing over him, and he softly asked, "What were those things?" The Emperor looked off into the distant, ancient memories shrouding his mind as he spoke. The great enemy, the 4 great beings of the Imperium, each claims godhood and mastery over the universe. But like all things with them, that is a lie. The Imperium is a realm where thought is given form and reality is subject to force of will. Those 4 are the sins and failings of all life made sentient and malicious. Uriah slowly got to his feet and spoke. So those things, they feed upon worship, and you seek to eliminate religion in order to cripple them. Not quite. They do feed upon faith, but not it alone. Every and all activities that fall under their purview feeds them, but worship is more effective. For example, the so-called architect of fate is empowered by every plan ever made, but cults of sorcerers worshipping and serving it are a far greater source of energy to glut itself. Trying to rid his mind of the abominable sights and thoughts born of seeing the 4, Uriah asked, "So why then, if they are going to keep feeding, why eliminate all religions?" To that, the Emperor quietly said, "Religion offers them an opening. If people pray to the gods, they hope for an answer. What do you think happens when the 4 listen and answer their prayers?" New visions then entered Uriah's mind to answer the Emperor's rhetorical questions. Entire cities ripping themselves apart in sickening blood orgies, or diseased corpses rising from their graves to consume their friends and family, blasphemous rituals tearing open wounds upon reality, allowing the substance of insanity to spill over the world in a tidal wave of damnation. Puckles out by wall. Shuddering at the visions, Unai tried to stay standing, but his knees buckled finally under the psychological weight. The Emperor quickly caught the priest, and Uriah felt warm, familiar energy enter his body, and his legs could again support him. Still entranced by the saga being regaled to him, Uriah asked the question that had been on his mind since before the visions the Emperor had shown him. "You said humanity's need for faith is your fault. What do you mean?" A sadness darkened the emperor's features as he summoned another vision to show Uriah, "You are the last priest of the last church of Terra. I have deemed it fitting for you to hear my confession. None know this tale, not even my closest advisors and friends. You being the last priest, it seemed only right for you to hear the story of the first temple." With that, Uriah found himself transported to an arid badlands. Sand and stone stretched as far as the eye could see. Uriah looked up and was shocked. The sky was impossibly blue, and Sol hung high in the clear sky. "Where are we?" asked Uriah, as the shock of seeing the sky hit him. Appearing next to him, the emperor responded, "Approximately 35,000 years ago in a land you know as the Achaemenid Empire." As the emperor spoke, a lone figure appeared in the distance. The figure approached them and adjusted its ragged robes, and Uriah saw its face. The priest did a double take at the sight. The strange traveler was the emperor, a younger, barely 2-decade-old emperor by the look of it. Uriah pointed at the doppelganger, and the emperor explained before Uriah could say anything, "We are viewing my memories of this age. We are invisible witnesses to this saga of my youth." The twin watchers of the memory followed the young emperor through the desert. They trudged for miles as the emperor of the present spoke. "In my youth I wandered Terra, spreading knowledge and wisdom to the ancient tribes and early civilizations. Nothing to major, just slight nudges to help technological and philosophical development. I tried to never get too involved, not to let any group become reliant on my presence. My purpose has always been to guide and protect. Humanity cannot be allowed to rely on me, for it will weaken them." Imperium raised an eyebrow at that and asked, "Then why are you seeking to conquer and control humanity as its emperor?" A pained look crossed his face. "Despite what you and many others might think, I have no desire to rule. If there was another option than the Imperium, I would take it." They crested a hill with the memory form of the emperor, and before them, nestled on the shore of a great sea, was an ancient city. They and the memory form stopped and admired the primitive metropolis. The emperor continued his narration. "I had not visited this city in about 2.5 centuries. Last time I was here, I helped treat a minor viral outbreak and explained a bit of basic hygiene. I had done similar across the world and thought nothing of it. So when I returned to this city nestled on the shore of the Salt Sea, I was horrified by what I found." They followed the memory form towards the city. Great processions of carts and beasts of burden carried goods towards the city gates. Each was stopped and tolled by a patrol of thuggish-looking guards. The ancient emperor joined the line and eventually reached the gates. The guards looked the shabby-robed ancient up and down. "Leave, vagabond. We have no need for your kind here." The ancient emperor raised an eyebrow and began to motion with his hand before a voice popped up from behind him. "Uncle Ivram, so that's where you wandered off to." A well-clothed man from the line approached and touched the ancient's shoulder. Calmly the man spoke to the guards. "So sorry for that, my uncle wandered away from the caravan." Pulling the ancient emperor away and directing him back to his family and servants, the man continued in a whisper, "He is not quite right in the head, but I promised my father I would look after him." The guards grunted something in return. Imperium and the emperor followed the generous man and the ancient. The ancient emperor quietly asked the stranger, "Why did you do this for me?" The man shrugged his shoulders. "Kindness begets kindness. You are obviously not from around here, and it would be wrong to leave you out in the wilderness, especially on the day of the festival." The ancient shook the man's hand and asked, "A festival? It seems I am just in time. You can call me Revelation, by the way." When the ancient spoke his name, Uriah swore he heard 1,000 different words and names. Before he could ask, the emperor answered, "People have long been curious about what my name is, never considering that Revelation is not an alias, but how the human mind interrupts and translates it." The man, unlike Uriah had a few hours or lifetimes ago, did not respond to the strange name and simply said, "Nice to meet you, Revelation. I am Lotu O'Haran. You are just in time for the Festival of the Four. It's our greatest event that celebrates the city's salvation by the gods." The ancient then followed Lot and spoke with him and his family. As they moved up the line with their farm goods they sought to sell, the emperor began to speak as they followed the group. At this point, small tribal faiths and city-state religions were not uncommon. Typically, they worshipped nature in some form or another, and my visions forecasted they would eventually die out as science and reason grew to explain the unexplainable. The ancient and Lot's family finally entered the city, and were soon greeted with the sound of great drums. Rhythms and song filled the entire city in a barely organized cacophony. The ramshackle streets were crowded with thousands. The merchants and farmers peeled off from the line, heading to various parts of the city to sell their goods. The ancient simply followed Lot and watched. This was the largest city he had visited, and marveled at the metropolis. Humanity was truly growing and preparing itself for its destiny. Eventually, the ancient thanked Lot and split off from his entourage of family and servants to explore the city. For hours he wandered and was both entranced and worried by what he saw. Great kilns crafted pottery that was intricate in detail, but grotesque in what it depicted. Scenes of bloodshed and debauchery were carved and stenciled upon them. Filth-encrusted beggars wandered the streets pleading for spare food or currency. Each seemed more broken and diseased than the last. Eventually the ancient heard the roar of a crowd above the city's other din and investigated as Uriah and the emperor followed. Even though the dense sense of the city, the ancient could smell the distinct tang of blood in the air coming from the same place as the crowds shouting. Eventually the ancient found the source. Dug out of the earth was a crude pit, where hundreds of dredges clamored at its edge to get a better view of its occupants. With a slight bit of psychic suggestion, the ancient pushed past the crowd and felt a cold fury fill him at the sight that awaited him. Two malnourished, manacled slaves savaged each other with crude bone blades as the crowd bayed for blood and gore. Shock filled the ancient's face as Uriah and the emperor grimly looked on. Both of the observers had seen the worst of humanity during the Age of Strife, and enslaved gladiators were just one of those horrors. Speaking softly, the emperor gestured to his younger self and said, "This was the first time such an act was witnessed by us. Sadly, not the last, though." One of the slaves screamed with desperate rage and smashed his rival's skull into the stone wall of the pit, over and over again. The loser's blood and brains splattered out of the arena onto the cheering crowd as they chanted as one, "Maim, kill, burn, maim, kill, burn, maim, kill, burn." Disgusted and shook, the ancient quickly left the display and continued to wander the city. At each and every turn, more atrocities met him. Horror and worry wormed deeper into the ancient as he stumbled through the accursed city. What could have caused this? What was the source of this insanity? Eventually, a familiar voice called to him. "Oh, good to see you again." Revelation. Lot, along with his wife and daughters, strode out of the crowd and greeted the ancient. "The grand ritual of the festival is about to begin. Care to come with us to it?" Happy to see a friendly face, the ancient emperor agreed. Together, they made it deeper and deeper into the heart of the city. Here the drums and song was the loudest, and the throngs of people become denser and denser. Eventually, they reached the city's great ziggurat. Along with thousands of others, they ascended the grand staircase towards the highest point in the city. "What is this place?" asked the ancient. Seeming to puff up with pride, Lot answered, "The great temple of the Four. My forefathers helped to lay the first stones for our great altar to the gods." As they reached the top, a great pyre was lit. Incense and smoke filled the air as the city crowded around the inner temple. The pyre marked the entrance to the temple and provided lighting and projected an aura of mystic upon the grand temple as the sun set. Eventually the drumbeat increased in speed, and it cued the thousands gathered to kneel as one before the pyre and temple. Using a slight bit of warpcraft, the emperor stood standing while an illusion showed him kneeling like the rest. Uriah snorted at that. "Pride is a constant, I do believe with you." The emperor responded with an icy stare. The drumbeat came to a climax and stopped. Out of the temple in extravagant apparel came the high priest and his inner circle. The high priest stood before the altar and spoke in a booming voice. "Generations ago, our city was stuck with divine punishment for our sin. Death and doom stalked our lands and claimed whoever they liked. Countless wasted away and died under the weight of our blasphemy." The ancient's eyebrows shot up. Was this how they remembered the plague? Then how would they his intervention? The priest continued, "Then the stranger came, a prophet and wise man sent by the gods to lead us onto the path of righteousness. We were saved by his sacred wisdom, and the gods in their eternal mercy spared us. In an incredible display of controlled psychic power, the ancient used a mix of psychometry, precognition, and his own intellect to see into the past of the city. Both he and his watchers witnessed how a corrupt few had twisted the tale story over the generations to better suit their master's needs. Something was obviously twisting this city and its people to its will. The ancient had battled with monsters and nightmares from beyond this world or reality before, but this was beyond anything he had seen. Except for a few whispered memories from his predecessors, the high priest continued. Yet the gods, even with their mercy, require assurance, the assurance that we will not fall into the old ways and fail this second chance. We sealed a covenant with the Four, and we must prove our worthiness. We must sacrifice something precious to us in order to show our devotion. With that, a keening wail erupted from the temple, as 8 women, each carrying an infant, approached the altar. Disbelief shuddered through both the ancient and Uriah. Could the high priest really intend to? The women, no, the mothers, wore different expressions. Some were ecstatic, religious fervor enthralling them. Others appeared gaunt and dead-eyed, unwilling to accept what was about to occur. Only one sobbed and shook with fear and horror as she clutched her wailing infant to her breast. As one, they stepped up to the altar and were ordered to hold their infants above the blazing pyre. The high priest raised a blade carved from bone above his head and roared a jubilation to the gods. Praise be to the bloody hound, the rotting toad, the feathered master of schemes, and the serpent of sin. With that, he brought his blade down on his other hand, letting blood splatter out. At that gruesome signal, the mothers dropped their infants into the roaring flames. Prayers of adulation poured from the worshippers as the babies burned alive. The enthralled masses lacked the ancient's superhuman senses and could not hear or smell the sheer horror of what was occurring. The ancient stood there, his transhuman mind in shock at what he had just witnessed. Yet the atrocity was not yet over. The weeping mother had not dropped her child and held it to her chest as she sobbed out desperate pleas for her child's life. With almost casual disdain, the high priest slit her throat and pushed her and the infant into the blaze. It was that action that ripped the ancient emperor from his stupor. Time stood still for the ancient, and Uriah watched as reality slowed. Speaking with a mix of disgust and horror, the last priest spoke. "Ah, so that's why you blame yourself for this?" With a voice as colder than nuclear winter, the emperor responded. "Not exactly. The monsters of the warp used my actions against me, but my sin is what occurs next." Time returned to its proper flow, and the ancient cast down the illusion of him kneeling and stood alone among the worshippers. Before the high priest could screech at him for his disrespect and demand his execution, the anathema's wrath was unleashed. Warp fire concentrated into a burst of psychokinetic plasma, shot forth from the ancient's golden eyes in a blast of raw energy that the likes would not be seen on Earth until the next volcanic eruption. Instantly the temple, the priests, and the altar were reduced to their subatomic elements. The corrupted may have died instantly, but their souls were denied from their masters by the flame that consumed them agonizingly. The innocents were spared such a fate and simply became sheltered within the oversoul of the anathema. Yet the ancient had been an age and an attosecond late. The infants and the sacrificed mother were cast into the jaws of the thirsting gods. Golden light erupted from the ancient. Uriah felt the energy wash over him and his legs buckled. It was raw, more ferocious, and lacking the kindness of when it had healed him. But the energy was the same as the divine light that had healed him and saved him at Gadaware. Slowly turning to the emperor, he spoke in hushed tones. It was you not only inspired my religion but my faith." A somber look appeared on the emperor's face as he spoke. "Yes, you are not the first to find faith when exposed to my power. From 12 students, a desert merchant, the slave sage, and the 72 ascendant, each found faith and started faiths under my influence in an attempt to stop things like this." He gestured to the atrocity before them. Snapping back to the memory, they watched as the ancient glowed with power beyond anything ever seen by mankind. Slowly the anathema rose into the air, and for a moment the citizens of the city looked at the psychic beacon and wondered if salvation or damnation had come to them. The ancient emperor mustered his psychic might and brought something greater and more terrible than either forth. A wave of psychic might rolled off the ancient's body in a psychic pulse that moved faster than thought across the earth. Each and every human across the face of the earth was touched by the tidal wave of psychic energy. As one, every human touched by chaos and the whispers of the warp died. Like marionettes with their strings cut, they simply collapsed. Their minds shut down telepathically, and their souls scoured or destroyed. Even those not corrupted felt the touch of the anathema across their mind, and learned without a shadow of a doubt that there is a higher power, something great, golden and powerful existed. The seeds of every messianic archetype, every king of the gods, every monotheistic deity had been planted. Humanity had been touched by what many would call the divine, and was forever altered by it. A shocked Yara and a bitter emperor watched as the ancient slowly descended back to the temple ground and collapsed onto the ground. Every human being in 100 kilometers lay dead. 2 entire cities and countless villages and families had been struck down for their sins. Every human that is for Lot and his family. The ancient slowly got to his feet, still shaking with shock and grief, and looked at the 4 he had spared. He saw a horrific mix of fear and reverence in their eyes, and in a psychic whisper said, "Kindness begets kindness. Run and don't look back." They complied and escaped the dead city as fast as they could, trauma and religious visions filling their minds. The emperor and Uriah watched the ancient sit there with his eyes shut, and could see him trying to hold back tears over what he had done. The first great disaster in human history was by his hands, and he could feel the shock waves of his actions change the future. The warp had been thwarted in their attempt to corrupt early humanity, but at what cost? Isha slowly turned to the emperor, and in a half-whisper said, "It all makes sense. You are the source of faith, and you created this need in humanity in your darkest hour." Sadness distorted the emperor's noble features as he spoke. "I lost control. For 1 second I lost control, and this is what happened. Throughout the millennia I have tried to master and use this mistake to protect and help humanity. Yet no matter what I do, no matter what I say, more and more atrocities occur." The ancient eventually got to his feet after he sensed Lot and his family were miles away. The immortal held out his hands, and in a feat of psychic power and control the likes of never seen, he telekinetically triggered atomic fusion. A blast of nuclear fire erupted before him and consumed the city in a wall of death and fury. It was the first time, but most certainly not the last, that the being that would eventually be known as the Emperor of Mankind would burn away the taint of chaos. As the wall of nuclear plasma engulfed them, the vision faded, and the watchers stood within the last church once again. The emperor seemed emotionally drained and slumped onto one of the pews. Uriah shakily joined him, and they sat there in shocked silence for hours. Eventually, in a cracking voice, Uriah spoke. "You are right, religion is a mistake." Slowly heaving himself to his feet, Imperium continued speaking as he walked up to church's altar. "But there is a way. Humanity needs something to have faith in, to believe in. Give them something to believe in, and sate their need until humanity is ready to know the truth." Almost casually, Uriah picked up a guttering candle from the altar and dropped it upon the moth-eaten rug of the church. Fire began to spread quickly. The ancient building began to burn as Uriah and the emperor stared at each other. "Go on then. The last church must burn like the first, and I must go with it," spoke Uriah in a hoarse whisper. With a somber calmness, the emperor got to his feet and stood before Uriah. The priest shut his eyes and awaited his end. It did not come. Instead, golden energy flared, and the emperor cast aside his illusionary form and stood before Iria in his full glory. With surprising delicacy, the emperor brought his armored hand to the last priest's forehead. Golden energy filled Iria's body and soul. He could feel his body healing from 1,000 different ailments brought on by time and a hard life. In turn, his soul was purified from the touch of the 4 and became armored against them. In a voice that commanded armies and ordered the building of empires, he spoke. "Imperium Ascendant, you are wise for a man of so few years. I will not let you burn and be forgotten like the faiths of old. You are to come with me into this future. The shining path is narrow, and you will help me keep our species upon it." The Emperor of Mankind then turned and left the church with the newly ordained guardian of truth. Together they watched the last church of mankind burn to the ground. Uriah then asked simply as what once was his home became ash and dust. "So what now?" The emperor was stony-faced as he responded, "We have a species to save." Chapter 10. Let There Be Light. Date 782. M31. Kabul P1002 to the Shield Shup today. Location: Project Beacon, aka the Hollow Mountain, aka Restricted Zone Everest. Malkador was an old man, a very old man. He had lived for millennia and seen much, the end of the Golden Age, the countless horrors of the Old Night, and now he was both architect and witness to the next stage of human history. The age of Imperium was coming, and he was helping usher it in. These thoughts drifted through the Sigillite's mind as he wandered the topmost layer of the amphitheater-like structure that was known as the Hollow Mountain. A good chunk of Menton Everest and the surrounding Himalayas had been hollowed out to provide a location for the next stage of the great work to begin. Ancient vaults were being carved out of the deepest bedrock to contain the most horrific artifacts of the Old Night. Psy-War ruins had been rediscovered and were being rebuilt as a massive center of psyker training and housing. A massive chunk of Eurasia was being prepared for the construction of one of the largest terrestrial structures in human history. All of these projects were under Malkador's purview and were parts of the greater overarching plan he and his liege had crafted over the centuries. Yet the prime project within the tallest of Terra's peak worried him more than any other. A massive psychic device was being carefully constructed within Mount Everest. Huge quantities of manpower, arcane lore and beyond priceless relic from before the fall of the Federation were being used in the construction of Titanic machine. Malkador has taken more direct control over most of the governing of the Imperium along with oversight of the numerous secondary projects, while the Emperor devoted himself to finishing the Primarchs and modifying the work within the Hollow Mountain. This had not been the first time the Emperor had thrown himself into a project obsessively, but some of the Emperor's behavior had worried Malkador. The message had seemed to restore parts of the Emperor, and the once disturbingly stoic Ubermensch seemed disquietingly human. When Malkador had first met Revelation, he had seemed inhuman, and more akin to a machine than man in both temperament and behavior. When the idea of the ritual to cast aside what was left of his humanity to empower the Primarchs was first discussed, Malkador could not help himself from thinking, what will be different? Malkador had at first believed he had been accurate in his prediction. With the Emperor barely if at all changing in mindset or behavior, when the contents of the message from the so-called God Emperor was revealed to Malkador, he had been both horrified and strangely relieved. The future he had been shown, and how close they had come to it, had brought genuine fear to the ancient Sigillite, yet it confirmed something he had long suspected and hoped. Below millennia of trauma, stress and fear was a genuine human heart, and a good one at that. The Emperor of mankind had tried to discard his humanity many times, but now it had returned to him full force, and the effects were startling. Major changes to the Primarch project had been made. Certain inbuilt weaknesses had been discarded. Countless genetic defects were being corrected, and the maturing fetuses had been linked psychically in an incredible display of warpcraft. Yet despite what seemed to be great leaps and bounds being made, worries crept into Malkador's mind. The Primarchs were being perfected, not as weapons but as humans, perfect humans meant to conquer and rule. Such things had been attempted before throughout history. Malkador had seen the records and the Emperor's own memories of the events. The results had been horrific, and the Emperor's sons were leagues beyond the various gene tyrants of the distant past. Even if a galaxy-burning civil war was averted and chaos was thwarted, they may be stuck with a whole new host of problems created by entitled self-declared heirs to the Imperium. Contingencies for that eventuality were being developed, and Malkador could only hope the progeny of the anathema inherited his love of humanity and desire to protect and shepherd the species. The last priest was to apparently be involved in this effort to humanize the Primarchs, along with the Asamatrari, another thing the Emperor had drafted up to hopefully ensure the functionality of the Primarchs. Maternal figures to help raise the Primarchs into healthy functioning humans. Psychological profiles had been written on the ideal mothers for each Primarch based as Svedanta search was on to find these women, before the Primarchs finished gestation. The other project worried him even more, for there seemed to be far too few contingencies in place in regard to the machine within Everest. Last-minute changes to the design had baffled even the greatest minds of the Terra clan, and Malcador had to draw upon the full brunt of his considerable intellect and knowledge base in order to understand. The warp beacon aspect of the machine had its projection elements modified to allow for more concentrated amounts of psychic energy to envelop the galaxy at the cost of efficiency. It appeared the Emperor intended to sacrifice broadcasting radius in exchange for a stronger radiant effect. Slightly more understandably, the Astra Telepathica Nexus had received upgrades in order for much larger and focused psychic linkage. Malcador theorized that these psi-uplinks were to allow secondary beacons to be created, or allow other beings to power or influence it. Lastly, and perhaps strangest of all, the deep warp linkage now allowed for excess psychic energy coming from the beacon or being focused onto it to be injected into warp in strange patterned bursts that would inevitably lead to some form of god-forging. These changes worried Malcador, especially the fact that terawatt warp sages were changing their estimates on how much energy the so-called Astronomican would take to operate. The original design would have already been intensely draining upon the operator, but the changes increased the required psychic power significantly. A truly massive amount of the Emperor's power was going to be dedicated solely to keeping it lit, and that drain was only going to increase once the Emperor left Terra. The machine had already been a dangerous gamble on the Emperor's part that required a solid chunk of his psychic power, but this seemed less like a gamble, but more of a mistake to Malcador, especially with a certain trend Malcador had noticed. Ever since the Emperor had returned from the beacon, his psychic power seemed dimmer, not enough for normal human to detect, and not enough for most psychers, but Malcador's warp senses were some of the sharpest in human history. A light temporary dimming would be little to worry about, but the lessening of the Emperor's power had not ended. If anything, it had gotten worse. In the few years since the message, Malcador had noted an approximately 1% decrease in his liege's power, and with no sign of this downward trajectory stopping, he had tried to bring it up with the Emperor on numerous occasions and had gotten vague non-answers that typically could be summed up as, "It is not something to worry about, and it's under control." These worries plagued Malcador's mind, and nothing could put them to rest. Had they dodged a bullet with the message from the future, or had they simply exposed themselves to other dangers? Malcador had walked about a quarter of the circumference of the amphitheater that formed the peak of the Astronomican as he mentally debated his worrying thoughts. Within hours, the Emperor would arrive from Luna, and the next step would unfold. Malcador shut his wizened eyes and simply hoped that he was wrong and all would go smoothly. Eventually, an adept entered the chamber and reached Malcador. He brought various tidings for the Sigillite to mull over. 2 more highly probably Asa Matrari candidates had been found. Initial reports from Iria about Oriok were worrying, and chaotic taint was suspected. The last preparations for ignitions were going smoothly, and the Emperor had left Luna along with highly classified cargo. Soon the Master of Mankind would arrive, and the next step upon the shining path would be taken. Final nervous preparations were made, and eventually the private shuttle of the Emperor made Vox contact. The Auric Aquila was inbound, and additional menial servitors were requested for unloading extremely precious cargo. In a scene that mirrored the incident on Luna, the Emperor of Mankind arrived at the Hollow Mountain and was greeted by Malcador. Yet much to Malcador's surprise, the Emperor was not accompanied solely by his custodes. The minute the dropship's doors opened, Malcador could sense them. 20 infant demigods had come with their father. The Sigillite simply raised an eyebrow as he knelt before the Emperor. "My lord, why have you brought them?" asked Malcador in a slightly worried voice. The Emperor simply smiled as 20 gestation capsules were emptied from his vessel. A capsule marked "I was moved" by the servitors in between the Emperor and Malcador. Both peered at the sleeping fetus, and Malcador realized his master's intent. The Primarch floating inside were not a fetus any longer, but an infant ready to be born. "You intend to bring them into reality with the Astronomican?" Malcador was shocked at first, but soon the Emperor's logic dawned upon them. The lighting of the Astronomican would mark the beginning of a new age, the Age of Imperium, The Primarchs would be born with it, forever binding them in the myth forms of the warp as champions of humanity and wardens of the shining path. This would dissolve any claim, real or imagined, the ruinous powers had to the Primarchs and break countless chains of fate bound around the infants and their destinies. The Emperor quietly responded, "We will need every advantage possible in order to survive the coming storm. The Eldar's fall has damned the galaxy, and the warp has reached levels of horror never before seen, except perhaps for during the height of the First War. Chaos will hunger for more and feels entitled to my sons. I will not allow the petulant abominations to claim any more of my children or species." Malcador nodded in agreement and watched his liege leave to make his own final preparations. The finishing touches were being made, and within a few months the Astronomicon would be lit. Custodes patrolled the ever-growing macrostructure of the Himalaya and helped oversee the construction and security of the future site of the Imperial Palace. Officials ranging from high-ranking adepts to old Terran nobles wandered the secure zones of the site. They had been summoned to be witness to what the Emperor's messengers had simply called the next step in unity. Malcador's agents transported hundreds of collected psychers into the Great Chamber. They ranged from simple telepaths who had been rescued from lynch mobs by Imperial forces too powerful, reality renders sworn to the Emperor's service. All had been hand-picked to be the first of their kind. The first astropaths. The great amphitheater was built to house 1 million humans, and only about 1,000 seats were filled with psychers. But Malcador could glimpse possible futures where legions of psychers were brought forth to be bound to the Astronomicon. Terawatt sages scurried about through the inner workings of the great machine, working to ensure everything was in proper order. The last work colonies had been emptied months ago, and now all that remained was fine-tuning and last-minute checks. The Emperor himself oversaw some of this to ensure his exacting specifications were met. Similarly, Genurites monitored the gestation capsules of the Primarchs. No side effects of the new gen alchemy or the psychic binding had been detected. But the disciples of Luna kept a wary eye out for any last-minute changes. 7 Arsa Matrari had been selected so far, and Primarchs I, IV, 6, I, 13, 16 and 17 would be welcomed into the world by mother figures, and hopefully their brothers' matrons were not long to be found. These and countless other preparations were being made as the scheduled day of ignition approached. The Emperor had secluded himself in order to prepare himself, and all save Malcador and Valdor were forbidden from him. The right and left hands of the Emperor were both busy with countless duties, both involving and not involving the Astronomicon. Thankfully, Uriah Olather and Arik Tyrannus both assisted with external duties and keeping Terra calm. Uriah had led a diplomatic delegation to the Antarctic city-state of Oriok, where the worst fears had been confirmed. Chaos worship infested the faith of the isolationists, and they must be cleansed. The lighting bearer was then sent at the head of a massed force of Imperial armies, and had reduced the glacier-capped city to ash and dust. Soon the dawn of the final day approached. Everything was set, and the Astronomicon would be lit. The 20 infant Primarchs had their gestation capsules set to ring the central altar of the amphitheater. A literal mountain of machinery had been built in, and around this single focal point to control and bind a massive amount of psychic energy. Soon the Emperor would light the beacon, and the next stage of his great ambition could be undertaken. Malcador, accompanied by Voldor and the tribunes, journeyed deep into a hidden natural cavern that had been discovered during the initial construction period of the Astronomicon. The Emperor had appeared to expect its discovery, and had named the strange cave the Place of Leng, and used it as a mix of personal quarters, laboratory, and meditation chamber. The 5 entered into the cavern, and Valdor felt a familiar shiver run up his spine. Custodes could not feel fear or existential dread, and were virtually immune to insanity-causing stimuli, yet still that slight instinctive shiver still existed among the Golden Legion, and was their only indication that he was experiencing something that would traumatize a mortal man. The cavern was a place where the material universe had been warped by things beyond human imagination, and it was filled with the planet-shattering psychic energy of the Emperor of Mankind. The Emperor meditated mid-air in the chamber. A corona of golden psychic energy flickered around him, and the chamber was filled with a miniature psychic star. The Emperor's form was semi-disconnected from the physical, and Malkador could barely peer past the wall of energy to see the ever-shifting form of the being known only as the Emperor or Revelation. As Malkador reached out with his mind to the Emperor and used his soul-bound link to pass through the Inferno, to touch his liege's mind, instantly Malkador knew something was wrong. The Emperor's psychic power had waned massively. Instead of the almost imperceptible decreases since the message, he had lost nearly half of his power, still far beyond any mortal but a shadow of his former glory. Genuine fear entered Malkador's mind. Something had crippled his liege and humanity. Nay, reality itself was damned if the great plan could not move humanity further on the shining path. The Emperor pulled himself out of his meditation when he felt Malkador's presence and began to consolidate himself. Both the materium and immaterium hummed with energy as the corona solidified around the Emperor's body. The Emperor, in all his golden glory, soon stood before them, and the custodes knelt unison. Malkador began to speak in a worried whisper. "My lord, we need to delay. You could not provide the needed spark without crippling yourself. What is happening to you?" The Emperor placed a steady hand on Malkador's and softly replied, "All will be well, my old friend." With Malkador and the custodes following, the Emperor strode out of the place of Leng. He walked with power and purpose, as his advisors desperately trailed him. Both Malkador and Valdor desperately spoke. "You can't do this, sir. It will break you." The Emperor shook his head. "All will be well, my old friends. All will be well." Using a minor bit of telekinesis, Malkador kept up with the transhumans as he begged his master, "At least reduce the initial radius from the segmentum solar to a more manageable area, 1,000 light-years or so." The Emperor stopped suddenly and looked at Malkador with confusion. "The segmentum solar? The Astronomican will have an effective radius of at least 50,000 light-years." Shock struck the Sigillite. The Emperor intended to not only light the Astronomican with his reduced power, but extend it to its full range, even with the warp beacon modifications. The galaxy would be covered in an aura of intense radiant power, but it would be far more taxing than the original, already rigorous cost of powering the psychic beacon. At full power, the Emperor would barely be able to do such a feat, yet not it seemed an impossible, nay suicidal endeavor. Telekinetic energy suddenly rippled, and Malkador brought his own psychic might to bear. He stood before the Emperor and the custodes and spoke in a shaking voice. "I do not know what madness has possessed you, my lord, but I will not allow you to doom yourself or the Imperium. This is suicide, and I don't know what has caused this, but I swear to you, I will save you." The custodes drew their spears and leveled them at Malkador, yet they did not strike like they would have any other to threaten their master, for his words spoke true, and the custodes were paralyzed by the conflict between their directives. They must serve the Emperor and follow his will no matter the cost, yet they must protect the Emperor's life above all else. The Emperor slowly approached Malkador like a beast tamer trying to soothe a panicked creature. Psychic power flared in warning, and Malkador prepared to unleash his full might to incapacitate the master of mankind. Before the Sigillite could even react, the Emperor had crossed the distance and placed his hand upon Malkador's forehead. "Your courage and devotion is admirable, old friend, yet you are mistaken. This is no folly." Malkador responded frantically. "Something is weakening you. I worry you will not survive the ignition." A soft chuckle met that, and the Emperor wore the amused expression of a benevolent king. "What is the first lesson that is taught to the warp-touched? To suppress and control their power?" said Malkador, almost quoting an old Golden Age text from when psychers were impossibly rare and the warp was calm. Energy pulsed from the Emperor's palm into Malkador's mind. A vision plucked from the Emperor's own mind entered Malkador. A psychic corona of familiar power and nature burned in the warp. The players of the great game circled it, ever watching for even a moment's weakness. Honan gem the strength lithe. One out what a socket of either the fard surrounded them. Diving into the anathema star, past its bulwark inferno of willpower and sanity. Protected by his link to the Emperor, he plunged deeper into the star. Hinbu, what's look what do you that to bilister deeper and deeper, until the laughter of thirsting gods could no longer be heard. He surfaced in the star's heart, mind's eye nearly blinded by its radiance. Hidden behind a star's corona was a galaxy, vaster o me tretithad, fagalor to tigoging, fagatad what thunderbalted the Moroth, what to be swalked pleasoth, from me swalk and norgos to company de famish ball, fakajumering, nears wom. A quintillion souls shone before him in a mimicry of the material galaxy, all bound together in an eternal song of revelation and sheltered within galactic arms, born of fallen suns. At the center was a mass of psychic power greater than anything ever seen, a supermassive flame that linked the million martyrs surrounding it. With a great shuddering gasp, Malkador slammed back into reality and barely caught himself on his forestaff. Psychically imbued golden tears trickled down the ancient Sigilite's face. The Emperor comforted his stunned friend and spoke. "The best place to hide something is in plain sight. I am sorry you did not realize the truth sooner, Malkador. I am still adapting to my new capabilities, and I did not realize the truth would be hidden even from you." After helping to steady Malkador, the Emperor continued on his path with his entourage close behind. Malkador's mind churned. The sheer power the Emperor had displayed was virtually impossible. The only psychic phenomena he had seen of that caliber was when the Elder's insanity had ripped open the galaxy, and then it had only been a split-second shade of the Emperor's current might. A new golden age just might be in their grasp, and the grim darkness of the future may yet be avoided. Eventually, they reached the chamber of the Astronomican. Malkador and the custodes watched as the Emperor walked onto the center of the altar. As he did, machines whirred to light and thousands of psychers began to sing a meditative chant. The 20 infant Primarchs slept in their capsules as the Emperor began to summon his power. Slowly, a golden light started to pour off the master of mankind. An aura of majesty filled the chamber as he slowly rose into the air and spread his arms wide. Raw psychic power coalesced around him in a sphere of golden light. It grew greater and greater, as focused and linked with the great machine below him. Every being with a hint of psychic potential within the room could feel their soul be enraptured by the Emperor's power. The air hummed and the mountain began to vibrate as the Emperor's form started to blur and the golden light became brighter than soul. As the cascade of energy reached its climax, a single sentence could be heard across Terra, a single psychic phrase that echoed in a billion minds. Chapter 11. Angels and Demons. Golden fire erupted from the Emperor in a titanic pulse. White-hot psychic energy rippled through both the materium and immaterium in a tidal wave of unstoppable might. It took both an age and an attosecond for the Astronomican's light to reach the galaxy's edge. Every being in the galaxy with any form of connection to the warp could feel the shift. As if a torch was ignited in a once dark room, the warp now shone with psychic light. Xenos of all kinds sensed an oncoming storm, one that would come to right past wrongs and cleanse the galaxy no matter the cost. Some psychers were entranced by the light and felt the call of a distant leader and protector, while others recoiled in pain for they had been touched by the darkness and knew nothing of the light. The light filled the chamber of the Astronomican, and the Emperor shut his physical eyes and opened his mental ones. He had linked himself to the great machine, and it was now an extension of his will. The galaxy was laid out before him. Everywhere the light of the Astronomican touched he could see. Nearly all of the Milky Way was bathed in the golden light. Only the fiercest of warp phenomena could weather the psychic storm he had summoned. He watched the galaxy as the Astronomican's power spread and solidified. Warp storms born of the youngest of the Four's birth cries were snuffed out like candles in the wind. Warp rifts shrunk as space-time healed, and many of the smaller chaos-born gouges in the universe were sealed shut by the Emperor's sheer force of will. Holes into the immaterium were sewed shut. Daemon worlds were burned to ash and joined the life cycle of the universe again, untainted. Millions of gaping galactic wounds torn open by the Eldar's folly were cauterized and sealed. Even the great breaches into the warp were affected. Radiant tides of psychic fire crashed into the newly born Eye of Terra and burned away the corruption, purifying light years of void. The warp was aflame with psychic light, and the Emperor could feel countless tendrils of corruption and taint be pulled sharply back into the realms of chaos as their creators felt the scorching heat of the anathema's light. The Emperor braced himself psychically, as he knew what would come next. The self-proclaimed masters of the Imperium would come calling. In a parody of an ocean swell, the warp shuddered. While the Emperor's light burned constantly on the surface of the Sea of Souls, leviathans dwelled deep within it. The four were coming to confront him. The Imperium shook as the four dredged themselves out of their lairs. The Emperor's mind and will covered the galaxy, acting as a lighthouse centered upon Terra. He stood within the warp as both beacon and beacon keeper, waiting for the great enemy to arrive. Soon the leviathans breached, and the four storms of incalculable power surrounded him. They were everywhere around him and in the far distance as well. Each sought to extinguish the burning light. Enough psychic energy to corrupt an entire segmentum was thrown at the beacon. Imagined energy and mythological matter slammed into the Emperor in wave after wave. The Emperor of ages past would have been able to weather this storm as well, but barely. This Emperor, empowered by the blood of martyrs, was a different tale. After an instantaneous age of chaos slamming its might into the Emperor's psychic bulwark, he spoke. In a voice that shook the Imperium, the Emperor addressed the four. "Are you done yet?" Well, the sheer disdain and psychic weight of his words slammed into the storms with far more effectiveness than their tantrums. The assault petered out, and the storms became solid. Four self-proclaimed gods faced the master of mankind. Their forms shifted constantly. Human, xeno, beast, abomination, they shape-shifted in an ever-changing psychotic kaleidoscope. Any mortal would have long gone insane from being in their presence, and even the Emperor could barely view them in their entirety. The four circled around him like prowling hyenas searching for any weakness or flaw to exploit. In that moment, more of the Chaos God's attention was upon the Emperor than anywhere else in the material. Space-time itself would have ripped open under such pressure, yet the master of mankind stood firm. Their alien intellects and spiritual power bored into the Emperor, willing him to collapse under their virtually unlimited power. The Emperor said nothing and simply raised his hands slowly like an ancient conductor of music. Flames started to pour out of the Emperor in a slow building inferno that pierced the depths of the warp. While the Astronomican boiled the surface of the Sea of Souls, these spears, swords, spikes of heat, light, holy energy were hurled deep into the realm heart core of the Chaos Gods. Right as the lances struck them, warrior memories/spirits came into being and struck the four. Phantoms of ghost shards of corrupted godlings lashed out at their doom. A snarling berserker gouged the blood-soaked Hound King with dragon-toothed axes and roared, "I am no one's slave. You are not my master, or not my master." Molten metal arms gripped the thirsting folly snake tightly and seared it, not flesh in ways intolerable even to it. Silver-haired, bladed warrior moved faster than lighting and punctured the snake's heart with a whisper, "For Ferris, caught." Rotten flesh burned, sliced, the ghastly grandfather wept. A reaping angel struck over and over as he chanted in a raspy voice, "I am not weak, rotten hell witch thing." A trillion eye mouths were silenced, blinded by a one-eyed king. Knowledge power poured into the screaming crystal and burned it like fire acid. Its laugh weeping was met with a simple soft retort, "I am not your puppet." The Chaos Gods were smashed back. Their unassailable might was assailed, and the four lies flickered. Recovering and putting down a billion revolts and warp-born anarchy, they approached their enemy again. The Emperor watched as the monsters approached warily. A mirthless grin appeared on his face as he said, "The tables have turned, abominations. That was just a taste of what you have coming." The four spoke in undivided chaos. Their 4 trillion voices were one. "What do you want, anathema?" The last word was spat, more like an insult than name or title. "You have protected your godlings and pollute our kingdom with your wretched fire. Why are you here?" A vicious sneer crossed the Emperor's perfect, terrifying features. "I am here to discuss the terms of your surrender." The warp was silent for an aged moment before laughter screams echoed throughout it, in a psychotic display of mirth that drove a billion random mortal across the galaxy utterly insane. "Surrender, you are a greater fool than we ever thought, anathema. You have done nothing, except for delaying, quickening the inevitable." You will fall, anathema. Your species will embrace us more fully than any other, and all you have done will be for naught. The flames intensified with his fury, and the warp froze with the Emperor's cold fury. In a black iron growl he answered their taunts calmly. I am here to offer you an alternative to your extinction. If you reject my proposition, there will be no mercy, and I will ensure your elimination. The laughter of the thirsting gods continued in a sickening, mocking cacophony. Foolish child of man, you are not even a player in our great game, just a delusional pawn hoping to scratch the hand-tendril paw that moves it. Another wave of hate flame crashed into the chaos gods, but with diminished effects. The laughter only increased in volume. You are nothing, anathema, just another in the infinite multiverse to toy with and ruin, so speak your bit. It might be amusing to see what you could possibly want. The Emperor gathered himself. He had never once considered the idea of negotiation with the tumor gods, but no matter the outcome, it would further his plans. Disconnect from the material, passively feed on naturally generated emotions. No more corruption, no more incursions, no more insanity. You are to leave my sons, my species, and my universe alone. Again the warp was silent before the laughter erupted again, louder and more horrifically mocking than before. How banal and pathetic. We hoped it would be something more interesting, like asking to join us in godhood. We all know that's what you truly desire, to be like us, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent, to control everything as you see fit. You want to bring order to everything. The idea is amusing, at least. It would almost be fun to gain another rival/sibling piece. So how about it? Anathema, join us in our growing pantheon. We gained a new member a few eons moments ago, and we would be happy to have you. Blades of righteous fury cut the warp as the Emperor's wrath increased. I am not a god, and neither are any of you. A sly chuckle responded. Oh, then why do you dress yourself and your creations so? Angels? Crusades? Omnissiah? You tell all that you are not divine, then try to act the part. So come join us, Emperor, and become what you have always been destined to be, the God Emperor of mankind. Visions of legions of light, gods of the new order and unity in the face of fire and flame echoed before the Emperor as he responded. The warp is a place where myths become fact and symbolism becomes strength. The titles that are often given to you and your ilk is daemons and dark gods. What better way to cast down hellspawn than with an army of angels? New visions then entered his mind, of heresy, betrayal, and insanity. Oh, but anathema, you know as well as we do that angels can fall. 9 myth forms sprung into being, each formed from future memories and destinies thwarted. The 9 things were broken parodies of the traitor Primarchs, lacking the true glory or horror of them either in human or demonic states, simply warped flesh carved into the shape of fallen sons. The Goliarchs lumbered forward bellowing demented war screams. Before the things could react, they had been obliterated. Blade flames had slashed them to ashes pieces. The mad laughter grew in intensity at the filicidal display. Once the last of the Goliarchs, a whimpering parody of mighty Lupercal, was slain, they spoke again. We reject your terms, anathema, and offer our own. Give us our due, and we shall leave your species be. Give us 4 of your sons, and we will spare you and the rest. The Emperor could see flickers of futures where the 4 were made flesh. Avatars of chaos, each greater and more terrible than anything the mortal realm had ever seen unleashed. They continued in mocking, seductive screaming. Simply give to us what is owed, and we will find other toys to play with. Gritting his teeth, the Emperor snarled. I owe you abominations nothing. How dare you? First, you attempt to steal away my sons, and now you attempt to barter for them like livestock. My attempts to negotiate with you was obviously a fool's errand. Begone, you tumors, born of ancient folly. The Chaos Gods simply laughed. How human. Denying you owe us a debt in the creation of your children. For the powers of the warp, the very substance of our being was used in their creation. Are they not our children as much as they are yours? You came to us on Moloch and stole from us. All we want is a minor amount of restitution. Anathema. A column of golden fire detonated. Soul flames burnt the 4 undivided back as the Emperor marshaled his power and roared. I stole nothing from you, you errant tools. On Moloch my birthright was reclaimed, and I will use it to ensure your absolute annihilation." The four undivided hissed and screeched as the flames lapped at them. "Choose anathema, 4 or half. We will claim our prize eventually." More energy cascaded into the Chaos Gods, evaporating entire figment realms and burning the false flesh of their avatars. The four fled from his wrath, all while leaving one final whispered threat. "You are not the first anathema to fall, but you will be the last. We will ensure that revelation." With the four gone, the Emperor let out a deep breath. He looked, sensed, touched the galaxy that was blanketed with his power, and thought to himself, "The shining path widens still." As the final wave of the Astronomican's ignition reached the galaxy's edge and solidified, the Emperor allowed himself to return to his physical form. The instant he did, the Emperor was greeted by a sound as old as humanity, a sound that instilled countless emotions in all the children of Terra who heard it. The sound of humanity's future, the sound of crying infants. With the birth of the Emperor's will made light came the birth of his will made flesh. 20 Primarchs had been born. Chapter 12. Children of Terra. Date 790, M30. Location: the Emperor's private quarters within the inner palace. The Emperor rarely slept. His apex mind and physiology did not require it. During periods of crisis, he had spent literal years awake with no physical side effects, and he doubted centuries of consciousness would have an effect. Yet he still chose to sleep occasionally. Not much, just a night once a week, where he shut his eyes and allowed himself to rest. He had been mildly surprised when this ancient practice of his had somehow influenced some of the religions that had sprung up in his wake. They called it the Sabbath, like many of the quirks he had picked up throughout the millennia. It had unintended consequences upon human history. These Sabbaths reminded him of that, and the consequences of even the smallest errors. Yet reminding him of lessons long ago learned was only one of the reasons the Emperor decided to still sleep. It helped him feel human, feel more connected to his species. He knew logically that engaging in basic bodily maintenance did not actually make him more human, but when he went long periods without it, he felt himself becoming distant, aloof, and worryingly alien. The reason for this is related to how sleep, and in particularly dreams, connects to the warp. When mortals dream, they touch the surface of the warp and come into contact with their species' collective oversoul. Here they touch into what an ancient friend of the Emperor named the collective unconscious. When the Emperor slept, he did not experience the random regurgitated memories and emotions of his subconscious mixed with the warp, but something much more precise and powerful. He touched the oversoul of the human species and could feel the gestalt consciousness of humanity. It was not unique to him, and any alpha-class psyker or higher could manage it, but few did for what they saw. There was enough to drive even the most iron-willed psyker mad. The human species was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. The horrors of the old night had touched every human alive. Fear and grief plagued their subconscious, as memories, both cultural and their own inspired nightmares, more horrific than anything seen in human history. Xeno-predators drinking the bones of billions and leaving the survivors to clean up continents of distorted corpses. Green brutes mutilating people into cattle. Material madness exploding out of a witch's skull and sacrificing its world to chaos. The Emperor's Sabbath helped him reconnect with his humanity. And since the ignition of the Astronomican, 8 years whispers a simple phrase into the dreams of trillions of Terra's lost children. Salvation is nearer, children of Terra. It was a promise he made both to them and himself. Soon the next step on the shining path will be taken, and the Great Crusade would launch. 12 years left to get everything ready. More time needed than he had originally wanted, but it would be worth it. The Emperor floated in the dreamscape and brought himself back to Terra, and watched over the homeworld of his species. He dove, looked into the palace. It was still under construction, but the dungeons and the basic skeleton were completed. Peering through layer and layer of the palace, he watched the millions of the souls that inhabited the inner palace, and looked for 20 in particular. Every time the Emperor slept, he touched the oversoul, where the material and immaterial met, and reminded himself of what he must do. No matter the cost, he would end the nightmare and awaken humanity to a new dawn. When he slept, he felt all of humanity as one and could feel the future they could obtain upon the golden path. He chuckled to himself as he watched his seventh son's foster mother awake before any of the others. Petra Sauer may have retired from the Imperial Army a decade ago, but she had changed little. Catching warp flickers, he realized some of his sons still dreamt. He debated peering into them, and eventually decided a quick glance wouldn't hurt. A king riding a lion charged a mechanical dragon with the Knights of the Round following him. All 20 of the Primarchs were asleep within their apartments. They were called apartments, but in truth, they were subterranean mansions built into the Emperor's quarters, which in turn was a city-sized complex of rooms. Each apartment possessed full amenities from feasting halls to modular training complexes. The Emperor could see the various menials awakening to begin their duties, and even a few of the more strict Matari beginning their morning rituals. Octavia had so far proven far more stable than the version raised on Olympia, and he had hope for his son. The gene connection was tenuous, but some days he saw flickers of his old friend within him. Cities forged from imagination rose into the sky, constantly improving and being rebuilt by a conductor of equations. It appears Aaric had been regaling young Eddard with tales of the unification wars. The Emperor only hoped that the stories his sons heard were not as grisly or nightmarish as the truths of that conflict. They still had a few years of relative innocence. No need to plunge them into a lifetime of war early, screaming. A thing made of blades and lighting stalked grime-covered streets, filth in human flesh, committed unspeakable crimes, and the bladed thing did unspeakable things to them. The Emperor had raised thousands of children throughout human history, some his own, some not. Most of his biological children inherited something from him. Increased psychic potential, extended lifespans, and a rare few were true immortals like him, and some still even walk the ages. Yet even the ones who had inherited great powers from him had been simply powerful humans. These children, his Primarchs, were true superhumans in every sense of the word. A frown crossed the Emperor's face. Conrad's gift of foresight was great even at this young age, but it not only saw futures to be, but futures prevented. The Emperor watched the dream of Nocturne for a moment before he reached into the dream and changed it. That horrific future had been prevented, and he would not allow his children to be hurt by it. Each was intellectually, physically, and psychically beyond humanity, yet still human. Their souls were not that of an alien's, but simply more than human. He had crafted them with thousands of years' worth of knowledge in both the material and immaterial sciences, along with warp-born power. The 20 children were quite literally myth made flesh. These thoughts floated through the slumbering Emperor's mind as he watched the sleeping Primarchs. He could see the horrific futures he had averted, and could only hope that their fates were not the tragedies he had seen. In particular, he looked at his 16th and 17th sons. Horus and Philip both slept soundly, and a grim thought entered the Emperor's head. In ages past he had been forced to kill his children, and in a possible future he would be forced to do it again to save humanity. Dispelling that thought, the Emperor prepared to awake and return to the material. Just as he did, he felt a slight shift. One of his sons had awoken. A soft smile appeared on his face, for he knew what would come next. It had become a competition over the last few years, over which Primarch could wake up first on the morning after his Sabbath. In order to wake him up, the Emperor tousled his son's hair and spoke. "You did? I'm impressed, my son, but you still need to work on not alerting the custodes. Kota, you are a true master of stealth in the making. Now run along." The child beamed and scurried off to begin his day's training. The Emperor left his bed and telekinetically dressed himself as he spoke to the custodes. "Letting a child sneak through your defenses. He may be my son, but you are my companions." Kota Ravenwing often won this weekly contest due to his mix of speed and stealth, and was laughing in triumph while flitting around the Emperor's bedroom with the energy and momentum only a small child could possess. "Father, I was the first. I snuck past all my brothers and woke you up." Wincing slightly at what was to come next, the Emperor returned to his body and waited in a half-asleep state. He did not have to wait long until a black-colored meteor burst through his chamber's doors with a squad of custodes in hot pursuit. A heteron just had enough time to bellow, "Let your father sleep, Kota," before the 19th Primarch barreled into the Emperor's sleeping from. Even with the body of an 8-year-old, the Primarch's assault carried enough power to shatter a normal man's ribcage. It proved an unpleasant shock to the drowsy Emperor. Countless great works were being built across the planet, employing billions in the construction of new infrastructure and macrostructures. Material-wise, they were making do with whatever the Archo armies could scavenge from the depths of the old Earth. But the Emperor had known that the next phase of his plan would require Terra's twin, Mars, the red world of technology. The lead custodes responded, "There is no excuse, my lord." The Emperor let out a slight chuckle before responding, "To be fair, it is hard to apprehend a transhuman child moving at nearly 100 kilometers per hour without injuring him. Though I trust you will eventually find a way." The custodes simply nodded and left. The Emperor finished dressing and prepared to go about his day. The last 8 years had been a whirlwind of activity. Terra was being slowly and steadily rebuilt with primitive atmosphere scrubbers cobbled together by the Terrawat clan, beginning the long, arduous process of healing the homeworld of the human species. There had been a veritable population explosion thanks to the peace and prosperity brought about by unification. Captured cybernetic scavengers sent from Mars had given a pretty clear picture of what Mars was like. It lined up with both the Emperor's own projections and the God Emperor's memories. A culture of cybernetic tech worshippers, both far too curious and close-minded for their own good, yet perfect for the next phase of his plan. The dragon's dreams still seeped into the minds of Mars, but they were just dreams so far. The things sealed within the labyrinth still slept. Malkador and the Emperor had both agreed that the time to reach Mars was at hand, and the Emperor would lead the first expedition there within a month. He had honestly no idea how long negotiations would last, and he was not going to bring his sons to Mars while they were still so young. This would be the first extended period he would be away from his sons and the governing of Terra. The Emperor intended to use said month to ensure both his children and his Imperium would survive his absence. The Emperor strode through the inner palace, reading reports prepared by countless adepts under Malkador. So far the news was mainly good. Ilan was spreading the revised imperial truth throughout Terra. Agreed, Ilan. Malkador and the Emperor had crafted using entire libraries of religious texts. The imperial truth was the idea of humanity's eventual ascendancy, that by unifying as one, we were taking another step down the road of ascension and working to humanity's birthright as being surpassing any god creature. Aaric and his equerry were also keeping busy. The Primarchs were still children, so it fell to them to train the rapidly growing First 20, as the first batch of 20,000 Astartes were being called, one of each gene seed lineage. Once mass production of the legions start, these first legionnaires would form the officer corps of the quickly growing Legio Astartes. The Emperor had been working on a cure for the sickening of the Thunder Warriors. Astartes' gene seed had seemed to be a distinct possibility for a while, but they realized the organs would eventually reject the 2 Thunder Warriors and leave them in even worse shape. So far, a stopgap had been created in the form of blood transfusions from the Primarchs. Cloned blood had been used at first to some effect, but when they learned of it, the then 5-year-old Primarchs were all willing to help there. Uncle Aaric and cousin Golta. Malkador was busy helping create a bureaucratic system capable of actually governing the galaxy and instituting numerous backups and contingencies to help prevent the administration ever becoming the monstrosity of the far future. In turn, the Officio Assassinorum had made good progress through the list the Emperor had given Malkador. At this point, thousands of potential threats were dead. As of now, the Primarchs were growing quickly and mastering virtually every skill set the Emperor had them learn. Countless tutors and experts had been brought in from around the world to educate them. Each was utter masters of anything they were taught, but took to their preordained specialties like leviathans to the sea. Tarek could track a man through miles of the palace easily and hold his own against the custodes in single combat. Dante and Conrad were mastering the art of precognitive combat, and both Kota and Conrad could sneak through some of the low-security sections of the palace completely undetected. In turn, Vulcan, Culain, and Octavia were hard at work crafting countless new inventions for both themselves and the Imperium. The Emperor entered the Primarchs' hall and could hear the sounds of 20 superhuman children starting their days. The Primarchs' hall was a vast circular room that acted as a type of pseudo-courtyard to the Primarchs' apartments. 22 doors lead into the chamber and lined the walls of the chamber. The center of the chamber formed a park of sorts, a green space for his sons to explore and enjoy like so many generations of Terrans had in the past. The Emperor stood at the southern entrance overlooking it and taking a moment to watch his children play. He let out a small chuckle as he watched Miriam chase a mid-flight Dante. "Come back here, young man. You need to groom your feathers, or they will get damaged." The ruffled-looking Primarch tried to desperately flee his impending grooming, but a pair of wings and precognitive powers were not enough to shake his Matrari, especially since she had a psychic link to him that helped tell her where he was. Similar events occurred across the Primarchs' hall. The Emperor let out a content sigh. The Primarchs were little like the living weapons and warrior kings he had seen in the visions of the heresy. These sons of his were heroes in the making. The Emperor entered the chamber and approached the congregation of children and Asai Matari. Laughter and shouts streamed towards him as he watched. The Primarchs had not noticed their father yet. He cloaked himself in ancient stealth arts and psychic shadows in order to watch undetected. Chapter 12. Children of Terra. Date 790. Ayara 3 Unide. 730 Wa2 and Ideatide Fico. Location: the Emperor's private quarters within the inner palace. The Emperor rarely slept. His apex mind and physiology did not require it. During periods of crisis, he had spent literal years awake with no physical side effects, and he doubted centuries of consciousness would have an effect. Yet he still chose to sleep occasionally. Not much, just a night once a week, where he shut his eyes and allowed himself to rest. He had been mildly surprised when this ancient practice of his had somehow influenced some of the religions that had sprung up in his wake. They called it the Sabbath, like many of the quirks he had picked up throughout the millennia. It had unintended consequences upon human history. These Sabbaths reminded him of that, and the consequences of even the smallest errors. Yet reminding him of lessons long ago learned was only one of the reasons the Emperor decided to still sleep. It helped him feel human, feel more connected to his species. He knew logically that engaging in basic bodily maintenance did not actually make him more human, but when he went long periods without it, he felt himself becoming distant, aloof, and worryingly alien. The reason for this is related to how sleep, and in particularly dreams, connects to the warp. When mortals dream, they touch the surface of the warp and come into contact with their species' collective oversoul. Here they touch into what an ancient friend of the Emperor named the collective unconscious. When the Emperor slept, he did not experience the random regurgitated memories and emotions of his subconscious mixed with the warp, but something much more precise and powerful. He touched the oversoul of the human species and could feel the gestalt consciousness of humanity. It was not unique to him, and any alpha-class psyker or higher could manage it, but few did for what they saw. There was enough to drive even the most iron-willed psyker mad. The human species was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. The horrors of the old night had touched every human alive. Fear and grief plagued their subconscious, as memories both cultural and their own inspired nightmares, more horrific than anything seen in human history. Xeno-predators drinking the bones of billions and leaving the survivors to clean up continents of distorted corpses. Green brutes mutilating people into cattle. Material madness exploding out of a witch's skull and sacrificing its world to chaos. Every time the Emperor slept, he touched the oversoul, where the material and immaterial met, and reminded himself of what he must do. No matter the cost, he would end the nightmare and awaken humanity to a new dawn. When he slept, he felt all of humanity as one, and could feel the future they could obtain upon the golden path. The Emperor's Sabbath helped him reconnect with his humanity, and since the ignition of the Astronomican, 8 years whispers a simple phrase into the dreams of trillions of Terra's lost children. Salvation is nearer, children of Terra. It was a promise he made both to them and himself. Soon the next step on the shining path will be taken, and the Great Crusade would launch. 12 years left to get everything ready. More time needed than he had originally wanted, but it would be worth it. The Emperor floated in the dreamscape and brought himself back to Terra and watched over the homeworld of his species. He looked into the palace. It was still under construction, but the dungeons and the basic skeleton were completed. Peering through layer and layer of the palace, he watched the millions of the souls that inhabited the inner palace and looked for 20 in particular. All 20 of the Primarchs were asleep within their apartments. They were called apartments, but in truth, they were subterranean mansions built into the Emperor's quarters, which in turn was a city-sized complex of rooms. Each apartment possessed full amenities from feasting halls to modular training complexes. The Emperor could see the various menials awakening to begin their duties, and even a few of the more strict Matari beginning their morning rituals. He chuckled to himself as he watched his seventh son's foster mother awake before any of the others. Petra Sauer may have retired from the Imperial Army a decade ago, but she had changed little. Catching warp flickers, he realized some of his sons still dreamt. He debated peering into them, and eventually decided a quick glance wouldn't hurt. A king riding a lion charged a mechanical dragon with the Knights of the Round following him. It appears Aaric had been regaling young Eddard with tales of the Unification Wars. The Emperor only hoped that the stories his sons heard were not as grisly or nightmarish as the truths of that conflict. They still had a few years of relative innocence. No need to plunge them into a lifetime of war early. Cities forged from imagination rose into the sky, constantly improving and being rebuilt by a conductor of equations. Octavia had so far proven far more stable than the version raised on Olympia, and he had hope for his son. The gene connection was tenuous, but some days he saw flickers of his old friend within him. Screaming, a thing made of blades and lighting stalked grime-covered streets, filth in human flesh, committed unspeakable crimes, and the bladed thing did unspeakable things to them. A frown crossed the Emperor's face. Conrad's gift of foresight was great even at this young age, but it not only saw futures to be, but futures prevented. The Emperor watched the dream of Nocturne for a moment before he reached into the dream and changed it. That horrific future had been prevented, and he would not allow his children to be hurt by it. The Emperor had raised thousands of children throughout human history, some his own, some not. Most of his biological children inherited something from him. Increased psychic potential, extended lifespans, and a rare few were true immortals like him, and some still even walk the ages. Yet even the ones who had inherited great powers from him had been simply powerful humans. These children, his Primarchs, were true superhumans in every sense of the word. Each was intellectually, physically, and psychically beyond humanity, yet still human. Their souls were not that of an alien's, but simply more than human. He had crafted them with thousands of years' worth of knowledge in both the material and immaterial sciences, along with warp-born power. The 20 children were quite literally myth made flesh. These thoughts floated through the slumbering Emperor's mind as he watched the sleeping Primarchs. He could see the horrific futures he had averted, and could only hope that their fates were not the tragedies he had seen. In particular, he looked at his 16th and 17th sons. Horus and Philip both slept soundly, and a grim thought entered the Emperor's head. In ages past he had been forced to kill his children, and in a possible future he would be forced to do it again to save humanity. Dispelling that thought, the Emperor prepared to awake and return to the material. Just as he did, he felt a slight shift. One of his sons had awoken. A soft smile appeared on his face, for he knew what would come next. It had become a competition over the last few years, over which Primarch could wake up first on the morning after his Sabbath. In order to wake him up, wincing slightly at what was to come next, the Emperor returned to his body and waited in a half-asleep state. He did not have to wait long until a black-colored meteor burst through his chamber's doors with a squad of custodes in hot pursuit. A Heteron just had enough time to bellow, "Let your father sleep, Kota," before the 19th Primarch barreled into the Emperor's sleeping from. Even with the body of an 8-year-old, the Primarch's assault carried enough power to shatter a normal man's ribcage. It proved an unpleasant shock to the drowsy Emperor. Kota Ravenwing often won this weekly contest due to his mix of speed and stealth, and was laughing in triumph while flitting around the Emperor's bedroom with the energy and momentum only a small child could possess. "Father, I was the first. I snuck past all my brothers and woke you up." The Emperor tousled his son's hair and spoke. "You did? I'm impressed, my son. But you still need to work on not alerting the custodes. Kota, you are a true master of stealth in the making. Now run along." The child beamed and scurried off to begin his day's training. The Emperor left his bed and telekinetically dressed himself as he spoke to the custodes. "Letting a child sneak through your defenses. He may be my son, but you are my companions." The lead custodes responded. "There is no excuse, my lord." The Emperor let out a slight chuckle before responding. "To be fair, it is hard to apprehend a transhuman child moving at nearly 100 kilometers per hour without injuring him. Though I trust you will eventually find a way." The custodes simply nodded and left. The Emperor finished dressing and prepared to go about his day. The last 8 years had been a whirlwind of activity. Terra was being slowly and steadily rebuilt with primitive atmosphere scrubbers cobbled together by the Terrawatt clan, beginning the long, arduous process of healing the homeworld of the human species. There had been a veritable population explosion thanks to the peace and prosperity brought about by unification. Countless great works were being built across the planet, employing billions in the construction of new infrastructure and macrostructures. Material-wise, they were making do with whatever the Archo armies could scavenge from the depths of the old Earth, but the Emperor had known that the next phase of his plan would require Terra's twin, Mars, the red world of technology. Captured cybernetic scavengers sent from Mars had given a pretty clear picture of what Mars was like. It lined up with both the Emperor's own projections and the God Emperor's memories. A culture of cybernetic tech worshippers, both far too curious and close-minded for their own good, yet perfect for the next phase of his plan. The dragon's dreams still seeped into the minds of Mars, but they were just dreams so far. The things sealed within the labyrinth still slept. Malkador and the Emperor had both agreed that the time to reach Mars was at hand, and the Emperor would lead the first expedition there within a month. He had honestly no idea how long negotiations would last, and he was not going to bring his sons to Mars while they were still so young. This would be the first extended period he would be away from his sons and the governing of Terra. The Emperor intended to use said month to ensure both his children and his Imperium would survive his absence. The Emperor strode through the inner palace, reading reports prepared by countless adepts under Malkador. So far the news was mainly good. Ilan was spreading the revised imperial truth throughout Terra. Agreed, Ilan. Malkador and the Emperor had crafted using entire libraries of religious texts. The imperial truth was the idea of humanity's eventual ascendancy, that by unifying as one, we were taking another step down the road of ascension and working to humanity's birthright as being surpassing any god creature. Malkador was busy helping create a bureaucratic system capable of actually governing the galaxy and instituting numerous backups and contingencies to help prevent the administration ever becoming the monstrosity of the far future. In turn, the Officio Assassinorum had made good progress through the list the Emperor had given Malkador. At this point, thousands of potential threats were dead. Aaric and his equerry were also keeping busy. The Primarchs were still children, so it fell to them to train the rapidly growing First 20, as the first batch of 20,000 Astartes were being called, one of each gene seed lineage. Once mass production of the legions start, these first legionnaires would form the officer corps of the quickly growing Legio Astartes. The Emperor had been working on a cure for the sickening of the Thunder Warriors. Astartes' gene seed had seemed to be a distinct possibility for a while, but they realized the organs would eventually reject the two Thunder Warriors and leave them in even worse shape. So far, a stopgap had been created in the form of blood transfusions from the Primarchs. Cloned blood had been used at first to some effect, but when they learned of it, the then 5-year-old Primarchs were all willing to help there. Uncle Aaric and cousin Golta. As of now, the Primarchs were growing quickly and mastering virtually every skill set the Emperor had them learn. Countless tutors and experts had been brought in from around the world to educate them. Each was utter masters of anything they were taught, but took to their preordained specialties like leviathans to the sea. Tarek could track a man through miles of the palace easily and hold his own against the custodes in single combat. Dante and Conrad were mastering the art of precognitive combat, and both Kota and Conrad could sneak through some of the low-security sections of the palace completely undetected. In turn, Vulcan, Culain, and Octavia were hard at work crafting countless new inventions for both themselves and the Imperium. The Emperor entered the Primarchs' hall and could hear the sounds of 20 superhuman children starting their days. The Primarchs' hall was a vast circular room that acted as a type of pseudo-courtyard to the Primarchs' apartments. 22 doors lead into the chamber and lined the walls of the chamber. The center of the chamber formed a park of sorts, a green space for his sons to explore and enjoy like so many generations of Terrans had in the past. The Emperor stood at the southern entrance overlooking it and taking a moment to watch his children play. He let out a small chuckle as he watched Miriam chase a mid-flight Dante. "Come back here, young man. You need to groom your feathers, or they will get damaged." The ruffled-looking Primarch tried to desperately flee his impending grooming, but a pair of wings and precognitive powers were not enough to shake his Matrari, especially since she had a psychic link to him that helped tell her where he was. Similar events occurred across the Primarchs' hall. The Emperor let out a content sigh. The Primarchs were little like the living weapons and warrior kings he had seen in the visions of the heresy. These sons of his were heroes in the making. The Emperor entered the chamber and approached the congregation of children and Asai Matari. Laughter and shouts streamed towards him as he watched. The Primarchs had not noticed their father yet. He cloaked himself in ancient stealth arts and psychic shadows in order to watch undetected. Sensing a slight stirring in the Imperium, he glanced over at Tyrek, focusing his mental energies into his hand. The Emperor chuckled. It was a trick the 6th Primarch had figured out a few months ago, a novel use of the cryokinetic psychic arts that came naturally to him. Tyrek had formed a snowball in his hand and prepared to surprise his older sibling Eddard, who was busy eating breakfast with it. Lowering his perception filter, the Emperor appeared before his sons, just in time to catch the 500 kph ball of slush. As 121 voices let out a jubilant cry of "Father," the boys began to instantly jockey for his attention, as they boasted accomplishments and generally acted like siblings. As they settled down, the Emperor spoke to them calmly. "My sons, in 1 month the Martian expedition shall begin. Before I leave, I wish to spend this month with you, to see how you have all grown and developed." The Primarchs nodded. They had known this separation was inevitable and coming soon. They had steeled themselves for this moment and were ready. No tears were to be shed, for the Primarchs may have been children, but they were Primarchs and knew the Emperor's reasons, and that he would return to them. The Primarchs were beyond human in many ways, including their emotions. They felt stronger, purer feelings than most humans, which had contributed to the fall of the heresy in the timeline averted. The Emperor knew not of it a side effect of their warp-touch nature, or a simple quirk of the countless gene codes stitched into the Primarch's gene code. No matter the source, the Emperor had spent many nights teaching his sons an art that few sentients ever fully master: equilibrium of mind, a balancing of intellect and emotion designed to temper either extreme and strengthen the psyche of the practitioner. It was an ancient skill formed by philosophy cults at humanity's height, and often thought the evolution and perfection of countless meditative arts created throughout human history. His sons had greatly benefited from this, and displayed not just intellect and strength of superhuman levels, but a blossoming wisdom and temperance that would hopefully allow them to become the paragons humanity needed. No expense had been spared to prevent their fall, and the Emperor could only hope it was enough. The Emperor continued, "I am going to be more actively involved this month. My sons intend to observe you and teach you as much as I can before the next step is taken." His children nodded solemnly and went about their morning with a renewed conviction to make their father and Asai Matrari proud, and to prove themselves worthy of the destiny set forth before them. The Primarchs finished their breakfast in relative peace. The Emperor's presence naturally reduced the amount of mischief they got into. Next, they moved on to the morning spa. They used the massive training arenas capable of modifying themselves to mimic countless environments built into the palace. So far, the young Primarchs were matching an average Hykenautoi's score on most training courses, and a few were even starting to match and even exceed Iara scores. The Emperor watched them from an observation deck as his sons battled their way through an artificial underhive. They were each whirling masses of fire and fury. Thousands of vat-grown monstrosities and cybernetic death beasts died before the Primarchs. Each wielded weapons designed for adult mortals with practiced ease. The Emperor watched as Octavia and Culain fought back-to-back against unending flesh puppets that their bolters and Adrathics reduced to a thin paste. Alpharius and Omegon in turn disoriented and confused swarms of murder creatures into setting upon feral mutant tribes imported for these tests. These and countless other sights of skill and ferocity impressed the Emperor as he watched along with the Asai Materai and tutors observing also. The Emperor softly said, "I believe they are ready to have safeguards Alpha and Beta removed. My sons truly live up to humanity's warrior spirit." Meredith Kane, Caleb's Materari, let out a soft chuckle. "They already have been. This is lethal combat, sire. I believe Horus lead the effort to convince the arena maesters to allow it." The Emperor raised an eyebrow at that. "Is there a reason I was not informed?" Meredith simply responded, "They ensured you weren't. I believe they want to impress you." A melodious laugh escaped the Emperor's lips. "I am impressed. Such ambition, initiative, and sense of purpose. Fine then, remove Safeguard Gamma as well." The faces of 19 mothers flickered with fear. Mary, Philip's Matrari, was the one who showed no fear but calm determination. She answered the Emperor's command in her soft, melodious voice. "They will succeed. These children born of your blood and spirit and raised by us are greater than any of us could have ever imagined. The Primarchs will face any challenge and triumph. I have faith in that." The Emperor watched her confidence infect the others and felt his lips twitch in a smile. Faith, the enemy of reason, his sin and salvation in one. Millions labored under his and Uriah's instruction to harness that great force for humanity's benefit, to teach the children of Terra not to put faith in god things or transhumans, but in each other. Mary Atima had been a great success in that quest. Now she showed her reborn faith, her faith in her son and his brothers, a faith in human potential. With that, Safeguard Gamma was removed. The arena's gravity doubled. Its temperature started to fluctuate wildly, and new, greater, more horrific monsters were released to hunt and be hunted. The Emperor watched with a father's pride and a scientist's fascination at what occurred. His sons were warriors, and they proved that fact over and over. Baraka barely dodged a chain blade larger than him wielded by some leftover war thing of the techno-barbarians. It left a nick on his armor as he jumped out of the way. The creature was right where the 12 Primarch wanted it. A web grenade detonated in the thing's face, trapping it between two hab structures it had been lured to. The titanic thing was stuck, and with every struggle of cloned muscle, it became more bound. When it was fully trapped, Baraka decapitated it with a single strike of his blade. Countless other displays of incredible martial skill were displayed, from Iskandar slaying a dozen war screamers with a single strike each, to Rogol cleaving a path straight through a Gula pack with calm certainty. After another hour or so, the morning spar was finished, and the Primarchs retired to disarm and compare scores. Eventually, they made their way to the great library of the palace. This ever-growing monument to knowledge was a place of study and learning, where copies of trillions of texts were stored. It was also where the Primarchs were tutored in the countless intellectual pursuits necessary for their future. Today's lecture was about the Legio Astartes, the Space Marines. The Primarchs were expected to be as knowledgeable about their genesons as the greatest gene right or terawatt elder. The biology and capabilities of the Astartes were discussed in detail by the ancient sage of transhuman law, taken from Luna to teach his craft to the perfection of it. The Emperor simply sat in the back of the lecture hall and listened with quaint amusement. This had not been the first time he had listened to a lecture being given about his creations or accomplishments. In ages past, he would often find it an interesting pastime when he was walking in the guise of academic. The sage started the lecture with a simple question. The transhumans born of your genicode are formally known as the Adeptus Astartes, a title tracing its roots to Old Terran. Space Marine is typically how the term is translated into Gothic or other languages. But what is the original literal meaning of this name? Magnus piped up first. Adeptus has the same meaning as master, and Astartes means stars, so masters of the stars. The sage chuckled softly. A common error, young Magnus. Adept is the title of master, but Adeptus is the action, to master. Adeptus Astartes literally means masters of the stars, much like how the Adeptus Administrator masters the Imperium's government and the Adeptus Astrotelepathica master the Astronomicon and its uses. The sage gestured to the 20 Primarchs and spoke with a mix of reverence and hope. You and your Genisons were created to master the stars for humanity, not as rulers or owners of the galaxy, but explorers, conquerors, and defenders of humanity. An ancient Terran writer paraphrased a religious text with this famous quote: "According to the word of God, the meek would someday inherit the earth, someday, but God never accounted for the mighty. Your Father seeks to ensure a galaxy where humanity can grow and prosper under their own rule and guidance. Yet the galaxy is a place of many horrors that would drive humanity to extinction or worse. You and the Astartes are the answer to that conundrum. The mighty will protect the weak while they become rightful inheritors." The sage had been a good choice, the Emperor thought. He knew his theory well. Let's see how he does with practical. The lecture continued, as the intricacies of genocide were discussed. Its metapsychic nature and biological components were discussed in detail. How it linked the Astartes on both a genetic and spiritual level to their Primarch and by extension the Emperor himself. Symptoms of warp taint and natural degradation were discussed. Quick overviews of the 24 gene organs were touched on, including the bloodline-specific ones. The Emperor watched as the lecture carried on until Tengri, ever the quiet one, surprised the lecturer and siblings with a question. Why does gene seed reject some applicants? Shouldn't all pure strain humans be capable of the augmentations? The sage simply shrugged his aged shoulders. It is unknown why, possibly some genetic quirk, but only certain populations of humans are capable of undergoing the transformation. At that, the Emperor stood up and walked into the center of the lecture hall. The sage bowed and moved aside to allow the oldest and wisest of humanity's teachers to take center stage. The Emperor remembered countless similar scenes from his history of educating bright young minds, and it brought a smile to his lips. He had forgotten how much fun it was to smile. He used to smile maybe once a decade after the Iron War. Its horrors had burned much of his humanity away. Now his children, both living and dead, had restored it to him. In a lecturer's voice practiced and refined since he had debated Socrates, the Emperor began, "You are all my children, born of my blood and soul. But not that alone. Each of you was painstakingly crafted with all my knowledge acquired over nearly 40 millennia. I used my own genome as a template. But you are each unique." As he spoke, psychic images flickered through his students' minds. Of countless hours spent within secret gene vaults, the painstaking work was done to hybridize countless strands of DNA and imbuing said product with impossible warparts. Each of you carries genes taken from legendary figures from human history, along with post-human refinements unique to each of you. An ancient centurion of old Roma holds a xenoblade aloft. 5,000 cavalrymen were led by a stunningly handsome prince. The Emperor and a grizzled general discussed strategy as Iron Men's singularity engines approached. Justice in Black clambered between spires of primitive hives, hunting fiends and villains. A repentant cognizance ripped out chunks of his scarlet hair in sadness, as a golden-eyed warrior comforted him. The wise man lay dying in the Emperor's arms right before giving his speech. Word of the law. The visions danced through the young Primarchs' minds and showed them their genetic heritage. As the memories faded, the Emperor continued, "You are not just simple clones of me, and as such your lineage is only compatible with individuals matching certain psychogenetic markers. For example, Tarek's gene seed is far more compatible with humans who have spliced genes. Those with wild blood are much more easily accepted by his bloodline than those without." The Primarchs nodded and processed this knowledge. Marcus, ever the clever one, raised his hand and asked, "So that's why some of our lineages have an easier time finding candidates? The markers are more common for that type of gene seed." "Correct, Marcus. Your lineage in particular is one of the more verdant ones due to your genetic heritage in the ancient Ultramark League." The lesson continued, with the Primarchs learning more and more about their genetics, and generous with both the sage and the emperor teaching. This was an overview lesson, and more detail in the countless topics and intricacies of Astartes' creation would be discussed eventually. After an hour or two, the lecture concluded, and the Primarchs adjourned for lunch. The emperor followed them silently, and thought to himself, "Oh, children of Terra, your champions are coming." The Primarchs' day continued as usual with combat drills, legion exercises with the first 20, and more lessons. Another aspect of their education was a time when creativity was encouraged. Each of them engaged in an art or science they found particularly interesting. Some preferred more material arts like sculpting or smithing, while some, like Dante and surprisingly Mauric, preferring the spoken verse or composing music. Much to his chagrin, Dante's siblings often referred to his musical pieces as birdsong. The emperor spent the day watching and interacting with his sons. The long dormant joy of being a parent crept deeper and deeper into the master of mankind's soul. Yet still shadows of worries and his eternal burden clung to him. As he watched the young Primarchs finish their evening duties and prepare to retire, he whispered softly to himself, 210 years, hopefully enough time. The months sped by faster than either the Primarchs or the emperor could wish. Every day the Primarchs impressed their father through intellect, martial skill, leadership and wisdom, surprising for such youths. In turn, the emperor imparted knowledge, lessons and paternal love to them in preparation for what was to come. The day of departure grew ever closer, and the emperor found himself becoming confident in his sons. His children of Terra were greater than he could ever hope. Now it was time for him to bring the children of Mars into the fold.